Taiwan is bursting with heaps of fun places to explore. Join me, Amber Hatfield, as I hit up travel hotspots, soak up some culture, and hunt down hidden gems. Let's go! Hi and welcome to Let's Go. I'm your host Amber Hatfield. In today's episode, we're heading to Tamsui to explore the rich history of this fascinating coastal town. I'll be chatting with a representative from the Tamsui Historical Museum to uncover the stories behind the area's historical landmarks, its cultural significance, and what makes Tamsui a must-visit destination for travelers. I would love it if you could tell me first a brief overview about Tamsui's history and also its cultural significance in Taiwan.
So Tamsui is located on the northern part of Taiwan, and Tamsui has Taiwan's third largest river, the Tamsui River. So from the past, Tamsui River has always been considered to be the northern gate of Taiwan, and it attracts different parties to come to this place in different time periods. So originally, the local residents are the indigenous people, the Pimpu tribe. And about 400 years ago, the Spanish and Dutch people came here and constructed fortress in this place. And then next, about 160 years ago, Tamsui port turned into an international port. So foreign companies actually came to Tamsui and started trading activities in Tamsui. And also it has changed the lifestyle in Tamsui as well. And in the recent decades, Tamsui became more of a tourist attraction. So normally when foreign tourists, when they come to Taiwan, Tamsui is very accessible because you can reach Tamsui by the MRT. And they will come here to understand the local culture, to see the historical sites, and also the beautiful sceneries.
So I would love to know from you about the role of Tamsui Historical Museum in preserving this history of Tamsui and sharing it with tourists and people who visit.
Okay, so I just briefly introduced Tamsui Historical Museum. So originally, the most famous historical site in Tamsui is the Fort Santo Domingo. And initially, Fort Santo Domingo was managed by the Ministry of Interior. And in 2005, the Tamsui Historical Museum was formed and was managed by the New Taipei City. The special thing about Tamsui Historical Museum is that it is the first museum in Taiwan that is formed by a group of national monuments, historical sites, and all these sites are scattered in Tamsui area. So when you step into Tamsui, you are already inside the museum. The role of the Tamsui Historical Museum is to administrate and preserve all the important historical sites under its management. And the very important thing is that to raise the awareness to the public, so that the public can actually come to this site, understand the historical background.
Could you give me an overview, a kind of discussion about what are some of these key historical buildings that are in Tamsui for people to visit?
When you talk about Tamsui, people first think about Fort Santo Domingo. So in 1628, the Spanish people came to Tamsui and they set up the fortress Fort Santo Domingo. But today, when you come to Tamsui, you can no longer see the structure of the Fort Santo Domingo because when the Dutch people drove out the Spanish actually destroyed Fort Santo Domingo. And now the building that you see is Fort Antonio. It's named after the Dutch East India Company's Governor General Antonio van Diemen. So for Dutch people, actually that building is Fort Antonio, and it was built in 1644. Until today, it's 380 years old. One of the oldest buildings in Taiwan. And it's a very important building because it is the only well-structured building that was built by the Dutch still remains standing in Taiwan. And when you get a closer look to the building, you can actually discover that the building is full of military design. For example, it has a very thick wall that has a 1.9 meters thick, and it was built in a double vaulted design. as its core structure. But then the interesting thing is that in 1860, when Damsui Port was an international port, UK government actually rented the site from the Qing dynasty and transformed the building to be British consulate.
Okay.
Yeah, so it kind of like gives this building a new life. And I do believe that this is the reason why this building can be preserved until today, as well as right next to the consulate, you can also see the former residence of the British Council. It's a colonial style architecture. Although Damsui was not colonized by the UK government, but such styles building, it's so-called the colonial style architecture.
Okay.
So it's actually a very good experience that you can actually walk into the former residence of the British Council and see the most private spaces that the council and his family used to live.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I didn't know that it has almost so many different lives, that it's been in different people's hands, so many different lives over its lifetime.
Yeah, actually, when you arrive for Santo Domingo, you'll find that there are 9 flags installed in front of that red building, and that 9 flags is actually a microscope of Taiwan's modern history. Yeah, so you can see that it goes from the Spanish flag, the Netherlands flag, and then the flag that represents Koxinga, 郑成功, and then the Qing Dynasty's flag, and then it keeps going until the Republic of China. For Santo Domingo, there's definitely a very important site under Damsui Historical Museum's management. But apart from this one, you can also visit Hobei Fort. Damsui experienced another famous war that took place in 1884. At the time, the Qing dynasty had disputes with France. So France's strategy was to capture northern Taiwan and to negotiate with Qing dynasty. So that's why battle took place in Damsui. And after the battle ended, the governor of Taiwan at the time, his name is called Liu Mingchuan, he built 10 new forts to increase the coastal defense of Taiwan. And Hobei Fort was one of them. It was designed by a German military engineer, and so it's a Western-style concrete fort. At the time, they also installed weaponry that was purchased from UK. So if you like to see other sides of Damsui and also want to understand more about the war, Hobei Fort is definitely another place that you have to visit. And apart from that, there's another famous tourist attraction called the Little White House. The official name is called the former residence of the Damsui Custom Officer. In 1860, during that era, Qing Dynasty actually hired Westerners to act as Damsui Custom Officer to manage Damsui Port. And Little White House used to be the residential area for the custom officers. When we look at all the sites, it can actually divide it into 3 time periods. One is the Age of Discovery, which relates to Fort Santo Domingo. And then another time period, it's during the Qing Dynasty period. Yep, so you will find buildings like the Little White House. And then the next one is during the Japanese colonial era. So there are some Japanese buildings in Damsui as well. Like, for example, the former residence of Damsui Township head Tada Ikichi. It's a well-designed traditional Japanese building that I'm sure you will like it. You can actually have a closer look on the exterior of the building. At the same time, you can also walk into the building and see all the different areas of the building.
So the buildings that are still standing and that you can go to visit, you can also see inside the buildings. Like, do they have them kind of rendition like as if it's from that time inside the building?
Yes, you're mentioning a very good point. So this is also the role of the Damsui Historical Museum, is to restore the building. And at the same time, we try to set up the interior and try to let the visitors that can feel the lifestyle back then. or we might use the interior space to exhibit the stories or the relevant information about the building or about the site. Of Tamsui Historical Museum, there are about 36 national monuments or historical buildings. But currently for the visitors, you can visit about 10 places, 10 sites.
And I'm sure that while the Tamsui Historical Museum has been in charge of taking care of these buildings, there must be some preservation efforts, like you mentioned, for taking care of the buildings.
Yes, actually, it's very challenging for the Tamsui Historical Museum because, as you know, all the buildings they are built long time ago. So sometimes their structures are not that stable. Like for example, we have to deal with the water leaking problem. That's a common issue. Yeah, especially like for Santo Domingo, or Hobei Fort. Yeah, and also because in Taiwan we experience a lot of earthquakes frequently.
Right.
Yeah, so earthquakes, this vibration also have a major impact on the building structure. So we do keep a constant and long-term monitoring process on these buildings. And if any data indicates that the buildings might incline or have some severe damage, then these historical buildings will need to go through a long process of restoration. Yeah, for example, like as I mentioned, Little White House, the former residence of Tamsui Custom Officer. It is currently under the restoration work since April 2024.
Oh, so are visitors able to visit still at this time or not right now?
Currently for Little White House, the whole site is closed. So this is another challenge and dilemma faced by the Tamsui Historical Museum is that how do you actually preserve or to repair the building at the same time? You also need to like maybe partially to let the visitors to see part of the site. Yeah, and the case for Little White House is that because the area is not that big, so for the restoration work, it covers the whole site. That's why we have to shut the whole site down temporarily until everything is secure and complete.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. If it's somewhere bigger, then you could keep parts of it open and people could visit parts. But somewhere small, then you just have to close the whole thing.
Yeah, like for example, for the former residence of British Council. So the rear part of the residence used to be under repair, under maintenance. And it has been like reopened recently. So, which is a very good news for the visitors as well.
I'd love to know then what kind of exhibitions that you have at the moment in your buildings. What kind of things are showing? What kind of things can people see?
Actually, for every site, Tamsui Historical Museum use the interior space as a space to exhibit the related historical background or building features. So when you come to Fort Santo Domingo, when you look at that Fort Antonio, that fortress, you will be able to find information about why Dutch people built the fortress in such a style, and also in every interior space, different parts, you'll be able to see the facilities that was used by the consulate. Okay. And when you visit the former residence of the British Council, then in the interior space, you will be able to have a more closer look on the lifestyle of the British Council's family at the time. Yeah, so this might be interesting to Taiwan's local visitors. But it might also be interesting to the foreign visitors because they might not aware that Taiwan have experienced such styles building that was built in Taiwan at the time, and also such lifestyle exists. But there's one site that I like to mention, which is the Douglas and Leprick and Company. In Chinese, it's called 德记历史洋行. And currently, the exhibition that is in this site is called the Micro Museum. So basically, it's a very good starting point for the visitors if you have no idea about all the historical sites in Damsui. So when you walk into this micro museum, you'll be able to see like all the 12 sites, its features, and the 3D models. Actually has this interactive items for you to actually play with, so that for visitors to have a better understanding of what Damsui's history used to look like.
So when tourists want to go to these historical sites in Damsui, are there entry fees for all of the different buildings, or are they free to visit?
That's a critical question. The foreign visitors, there's only one ticket price, which is 80 NT dollars. Yeah, and you can visit Fort Santo Domingo and Hobei Fort. And it also includes Little White House. But it's just that Little White House is under restoration at the moment. And for the rest of the site, it's free entry. So like if you don't want to pay for the ticket price, you can still visit a lot of other interesting sites.
Even aside from the historical museum, why is Damsui a good place to visit to?
I think there are three factors that Damsui can offer. So a very historical and diverse culture, and also the magnificent scenery, and another one is the old street. So for the foreign visitors, when they come to Damsui, depends on their time schedule. If they only have limited amount of time and they just want to buy some souvenir or just want to have an experience of the old street, then they can just have a walk around in the old street and get that atmosphere. And if they have more time, they can actually like deep dive into all these historical sites. And I think it's very important for the visitors to actually understand why Damsui have such a diverse culture and building style, because of the diverse past that it inherited.
That's all for this week's episode of Let's Go. Thanks to the Tamsui Historical Museum and also to James, their English tour guide, for the wonderful and very factual interview. I'll see you next week.